Welcome to Theme 3, Gender, Bureaucracy, and Globalization. And I might as well warn you right now that the readings for Theme 3 are going to be as challenging as they were for Theme 2, but I promise from this point on, they will be much more related to your actual practices in educational organizations and will likely be more interesting from that perspective, but these readings are going to provide the theoretical underpinnings with which you can analyze much of what comes after this. So my apologies and my condolences, but also this is a necessary part of understanding more deeply the issues that we're looking at in this course. So let's look at the question of what do bureaucracy and globalization have to do with gender anyway? And it's a valid question, and it's an important question. And as it turns out, the answer is they have a great deal to do with gender and are certainly affecting how gender is enacted in educational organizations. And that's because at the macro level, globalization and bureaucracy, which are social, economic, and political systems, the authors argue that these hold gender norms in place. So there are systems, as we've talked about, kind of the systemic ways in which gender and gender norms are held in place. This is how this happens. And they are held in place in ways that tend to privilege white middle-class heteronormative men, while they challenge many of the gains that women have made in achieving equity in the workplace. And this is one of the primary arguments and concerns that Blackmore deals with in her readings. The authors also argue that reforms brought about in response to globalization discourses may be seen as a challenge to the progressive educational reforms that have characterized education for the last, I would say at least 40 to 50 years, with teaching and learning, cooperative action, and trusting professional relations at their core. So these challenges are changing practices in ways that these authors, and particularly Blackmore makes quite explicit in her readings, find somewhat unhealthy and need to be challenged and perhaps need to be attended to in terms of future reforms. So we're going to look at the first reading and then the second reading that Jill Blackmore from Deakin University in Melbourne, Australia, writes. Jill is a very prolific author. You'll see her quoted in many of the other articles that we'll be reading in the course. And her particular concerns are around gender. It's always at the heart of what she writes about. But she's also interested in how that gets played out through systems. And these systems in our organizations, bureaucracies, hierarchies, the technologies, one might say, of globalization and so on. So she's attended to those significantly in her readings, and they've become very informative in helping to understand what's actually going on and how it is that what we see in our educational organizations might have happened in the particular ways that they do. So in her article, Warning Signals or Dangerous Opportunities, Globalization and Educational Policy Shifts, which was published in Educational Theory in 2000, she takes up themes that are every bit as relevant, if not more so, in 2014. And she looks at the ways in which the state and the politics of the state have been suppressed to some degree because of the ascendancy of the market and the marketplace and the imperatives of the market. And so she looks then at how contractual relations that were characteristic of the ways in which the state did its business, including educational business, and these contractual relations between workers and corporations have been compromised by the demands of the state. Because the demands of the state are towards individual competitiveness at the expense of concern for community. And we see this in the competitive discourses that are at the heart of much of marketplace discourses, and because the marketplace is a global marketplace at the heart of globalization as well. So we see how this employer-employee divide has deepened as work becomes more casualized and feminized with the ascendancy of service sector jobs. So the depression of jobs, manufacturing jobs, and those sorts of jobs, for example, in places like Ontario here in Canada, some of the southern states and the northern, increasingly the northern states in the United States have been depressed. We see the breakdown of working relations between the employer and the employee, and the ways in which the employer is trying to get as much as they can out of their employee, to respond to the mantra of efficiency. And so this has become important in thinking about how educational organizations work, and particularly how these changes are quite gendered in their composition. So she looks at it somewhat historically as well. Jill is both a sociologist and a historian. And so she argues that just as feminism was beginning to ascend and create some policies that were in place, women were being protected to some degree by these policies and being moved into positions of authority in far greater numbers as a result of equity policies and so on. And so just as feminism moved to a consideration of more local, particular, contingent, and looked at the particularities of how women were placed within organizational settings, along comes the universalizing discourse and forces of globalization, which became dominant relatively quickly. And thus it weakened the work of gender equity advocates to confront the systemic power of globalization. So again, we see this push and pull, this, if you imagine a kind of weight scale, what was ascendant at one time has now been depressed, and the other has ascended. Not because the one that has been depressed has more power or weight, but because it has less, in fact. So it's kind of against that image, I suppose, in a sense. But nevertheless, so we have this push and pull, this movement up and down. So what had been ascendant now is depressed, and what was depressed has become ascendant. But these forces of globalization are partial. They're erratic. So we see the forces of globalization being enacted differently and differentially across the globe. So certainly in North America, the discourse of globalization is highly privileged in the ways in which policies are talked about and enacted and so on. Places that have been somewhat depressed are trying to move into this global discourse, but are in fact being used as places to produce for the global elite. So they manifest themselves differently within different contexts, and I'll talk about that more in a few minutes. So a response to its demands, driven by marketplace interests for competitiveness, one of the keystones of globalization, and accountability, another of the absolute keystones of globalization, and we could add efficiency there too, seem inevitable, and they must be addressed. So there's no thought of resisting these discourses. It is as though we must do it. So they have a tremendous power in how we organize ourselves in organizational settings. So what's public education's response been to these discourses of globalization and this inevitability of accountability and competitiveness and efficiency and so on? Well, public education's response across much of the world has been toward privatizing, so that competitive model, or site-based management, an efficiency model, where we're devolving risk and the effect of which has been devolving risk and responsibility to the schools, citing the need for individual choice, user pay, and flexibility. So you want schooling, you pay for schooling. And we see this in particular, and its detrimental effects when the World Bank and the World Economic Organizations come into the global south, so countries like Africa, where they are just a very tentatively emerging economy. And the World Bank is saying, yes, we'll loan you the money that you need to set up an educational system, but user fees have to be a part of that to demonstrate commitment to education. So these very poor countries where children are having to pay to go to school, in countries where they are least able to pay to go to school. And flexibility where, you know, we can move capital, we can move organizational directives quickly, and you know, be fleet-footed in making changes as technology changes and so on. So public education's response has been very similar right across the world. A friend of mine at OISE wrote a paper called Traveling Policies, where experts will travel the world and go from, for example, I can think of Michael Fullen, for example, who has moved around the world, and his ideas then have been taken up in policies that are enacted across the world. So these traveling policies that follow experts, and you could put quotation marks around that, I suppose, in some cases, and policies follow, and they're very similar. So you can look at another province in Canada, you can look at parts of the US, you can look at Australia, New Zealand, and you can see how these policies have moved from place to place in very interesting ways. But at the same time that there has been this devolving of risk and responsibility to schools, which is one of the policies that is very pervasive across much of the, and I'll put quotation marks around this, developed world. At the same time, there's been a concurrent centralization of power to the state. So there's been devolvement of risk and responsibility. Yes, Ms. Principal, you can make decisions about the finances, and you can make decisions about, you know, how you're going to do all manner of things, but you're the one that's going to take the risk of people who are unhappy within your community. And then the state or the central government can step back from that and say, well, we're just, you know, putting policies in place. How they're enacted, well, that's up to your school. And you can talk to the principal about that. So at the same time, we see this concurrent centralization of power and increased accountability regimes. So that those accountability regimes have been the very visible hand of the state saying, we'll put these policies in place, but we want to be sure that you're implementing them. So teachers can't close their doors anymore and do what they see as what's right for their students. They can't exercise the same kind of professional discretionary power. They have to do what the state says because we're going to be measuring the results of what you do. All of the above is concurrent with, so at the same time that all of this is happening, with disinvestment by the state in public education. So much more privatizing of many of the processes that were in place. And again, we see this unevenly across the globe. But even things like caretaking have been increasingly privatized by many organizations. Acquisition of supplies has been privatized to other organizations that do that kind of stuff, and we'll do the education stuff. So, so both disinvestment by the state in public education, and of course, disinvestment in terms of budgetary dollars as well, and the erasure of gender equity initiatives because they're, in quotations, too expensive, just as more women enter the workforce in response to a tightening economy. So she sees this as the decline, if not death, of the state, and the future of gender equity policy in education is shaky at best. So while the state was seen as masculinized prior to these shifts, it was also an enabler of women's progress through access to progressive reforms. And we see this in Canada, for example, with the equity reforms that were highly prevalent from about the mid-70s right through until the 90s, and then they largely disappeared. They completely disappeared overnight almost in Ontario with the Mike Harris regime that came in, highly conservative regime that moved right against any of the gender equity reforms and moved to a much more market-based policy. So since globalization, the state mediates the market, but it doesn't control it. So it can't say to the market, no, you can't do that. No, global money cannot move in that particular kind of way, because now we have policies that actually reduce the power of the state to be able to say those things. An example would be the recent highly secretive agreement that's been made between the Harper government and China. And I say that because there's been very little political involvement in that agreement, where China can come in and question policies that have been enacted in Canada and say they're against our interests. And so they need to be mediated through global organizations, not through the state itself. So since globalization, the state may mediate the market so they can say certain things, but they can't control it. Instead, it fosters a competitive economy which is divesting itself of responsibility for the public good, where public education is seen as a public good, and rather it's becoming much more of a private good because the market is seen as the distributor of educational goods. And this is highly prevalent in certain countries. It's much more mediated in Canada. And in Australia, for example, it's much more highly visible. And of course, that's Blackmore's perspective. Rather, it is privatizing responsibility for public goods, including education. And I've already talked about the conditions that are imposed by the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, which exacerbates these effects by imposing user fees, by privatizing much of the process of education. And that privatizing is where other countries come in and provide something that perhaps at first those countries, those developing countries can't provide to the degree that they would like. But it's not with the thought of increasing that capability, but rather actually importing the good of the public good of education from one country to another. And we see this becoming a highly prevalent process across the globe. It derails the primary means by which women sought equity and equality through the state. It's no longer possible to the same degree to be able to do that. Last night I was at a birthday party with some friends, and there was a friend of a friend there from up Island, and she was talking about her involvement at the government level with the status of women's committees and how she traveled the province talking to groups of women and talking to them about their rights and the ways in which they could exercise policies or advocate for policies that would provide for equity and so on. And of course, all of that is completely gone because it's seen as too expensive, whereas other things have taken priority in budgets. So addressing equity issues has been left basically to the mercy of the marketplace. And so we see some companies being quite enlightened around these issues and advocacy being able to be enacted within certain companies and organizations, but in others it's been highly, what's the opposite of proactive, deactivated. And we see, for example, some really egregious demonstrations of this, for example, in the United States and in places in Canada too, but certainly it's been more publicized in the United States. So what we have is a model where the center, that is central organizations like ministries of education, hold power and authority, and at the periphery we have schools accepting risk and responsibility. And increasingly, of course, those risks are being handled by women in positions of authority. In another paper that Blackmore wrote, which is an interesting one, she sees this as a strategic move of the state to move women who are seen as greater caregivers because of gender norms and so on, being able to take up the work of the emotional labor of helping people in those organizations. And she gets to that in the next paper. So public demands are seen as those of individual clients. Now we have parents being talked of as clients, for example, in public documents. Group demands for equity are seen as special interests and dismissed as unaffordable. And this is a pervasive practice across all of the provinces in Canada and most parts of the world. Women's issues are seen as a special interest problem that needs resources, and therefore, in a global economy where we have to stay competitive, we can't afford it. However, men's issues are generally taken up as, and I'm talking about men's issues in the workplace, in organizations, are seen as neutral and tied to the economy, and therefore worthy of attention. So we have this disparity developing over time, and through the effects of globalization. One of the other discourses that she talks about in relation to globalization is this idea of the level playing field for families, states, and markets. So she talks about the post-Fordist workplace, and by that she means, Fordism, the theory of Fordism is, the assembly line developing work in ways that are most efficient for workers, where work is broken down into highly segmented forms of work, and it's repetitive and so on. But it gets the job done quickly, and it gets the job done effectively and efficiently. So, but in post-Fordist workplace, where the service sector is ascending, women are seen as human capital. So they're being moved into these positions where service is at the heart of what's done. And they're seen as human capital both in terms of their role as consumers and also as producers in this service-oriented economy. Neo-Fordism is a workplace that's much more polarized between the skilled and the unskilled. And we can see the mediation of technology here, where we have those who are skilled workers and those who are unskilled workers, those who are rich and those who are poor, those who are at the core and those who are at the periphery. And we see power being differentiated along those bifurcated lines as well. So in this neo-Fordist workplace, work has become more itinerant. So the unskilled work or the highly skilled work with a very particular kind of skill attached to it has become much more itinerant. So if you can break down the job into very discrete pieces, with a particular skill attached to that piece, you can train a worker to do that particular piece, and they can do it over and over and over again. And we get back to those old Ford assembly lines, where now we're making iPhones in China, in sweat factories, where people are working at a particular discrete role for 16 hours a day and sleeping in dormitories and then getting back to work to make them the most efficient worker possible. So, and then this work gets moved around from place to place. So supposing China becomes less affordable, and again quotation marks, by Apple, then they're just going to move it to another place that will make it more affordable. So we see work of this kind being moved around the world in ways that are highly problematic because they do not attend at all to the needs of the worker, and will up and move away and decimate economies. So the economies have a vested interest in keeping that work constructed in that particular way. And it's highly problematic. So it becomes piecework using technology with little regulation or protection for the workers that are there. And in fact, regulation is seen as highly problematic because then capital will just move somewhere else where it's unregulated again. So workers are more and more finding themselves in positions where they're less and less protected. Women are particularly vulnerable to mobile, unregulated production. We see this in things like clothing production. I remember watching a film one time where in Jamaica, boats would come in, large boats, and they would come into an area, a port, that was not considered part of that particular state. So it was not considered part of Jamaica. It was kind of a no person's land. And these boats would arrive with parcels and parcels of material cut in the United States for production in these literal sweatshops, because they would be large tin buildings and the heat pouring down on them while these women did, again, these highly discreet jobs that were part of producing a blouse or a jumper or a pair of pants or whatever. And when those women organized for higher wages, those boats just simply moved on to another port and moved from Jamaica to Indonesia. And so we have this investment by the state in keeping work unregulated. So women are particularly vulnerable to this mobile, unregulated production. Education is increasingly relying on private labor, mostly women, paid and unpaid. So we have, for example, in paid, we have caretaking, for example, being increasingly divested to private companies, private organizations. And those private organizations often are unregulated and often are putting women at risk because many of those workers are women, or they're more other vulnerable populations, recent immigrants, and so on. And so we have people being put in these positions as work becomes privatized and therefore unregulated by the state. And then the unpaid labor of women in particular, mothers who happen to be at home, and increasingly mothers aren't at home, but those who are at home coming into schools and doing much of the work that used to be done by paid labor. So we have these differences happening. She also talks about the commodification of curriculum. And we can see this being produced by large companies, Pearson being one of them, for example, where it's produced by a board for profit. It is then put together in highly attractive ways by large publishers and then sold in many locations. And now that curriculum text has become highly mobile too, because it can be changed very quickly, or it can be technologized so it can be used by people throughout the world. But this raises questions about who's teaching, who's assessing, who's in control of the curriculum, what content is valued, and by valued I mean both in the sense of valuation, intrinsic valuation, but extrinsic valuation as well through the dollars that are paid for it. And how is gender dealt with in schools when we have to have a curriculum that can be used across many locations? How is gender then taken up in schools? Well, in most cases, it's not at all. So if you look through your curriculum and ask questions around whether there's anything to do with women, women's roles, women's issues in the curriculum, you'll find that probably there's very little, if anything at all. There's also a big discussion within globalization around flexibility. So these global shifts in patterns of work as workplaces attempt to meet shifting demands of the workplace, of the marketplace, and we've talked about that already. But the flattening of hierarchies so that companies can be much more mobile, so they remove layers of bureaucracy, which can be seen as a good thing in certain ways. But it also means that layers of work and those who did that work have been removed as well. And it's replaced with accountability technologies. So watching what's happening on the assembly line, in classrooms, etc., has increased exponentially through various technologies. And what happens as a result is workers then start managing themselves because they know they're being watched. And they conform to whatever the demands of the organization are, and it becomes a kind of an unseen arm of the organization in order to survive within the organization. So this has implications for worker wellness, etc. In schools, the dependence on schools of choice model depends on, in many locations, the deregulation of labor. And so we see, for example, in BC, in the recent strike, an effort by the government to deregulate labor to the degree that they can break the union. And we also see the casualization of teaching staff, and we're going to see that picked up, I think it's in the next theme or the theme after, in the Young et al. Article about part-time teachers. So the casualization of teaching staff, we see this certainly at the university level with the increasing number of casual workers coming in to teach courses and so on, outnumbering faculty by huge numbers in most cases. So equity is set against efficiency in these kinds of models, with the parameters of efficiency being set by the center. So you're efficient, you do these certain things. Equity often has to be set aside and sacrificed at the altar of efficiency. Not surprisingly, the center is highly masculinized. If you were to look at who's actually making the decisions in Alberta, in British Columbia, in Ontario, and so on, that center is highly masculinized by men who have positions of authority and have had positions of authority in educational organizations for some time. And the system has, this highly masculinized system has moved them into place. Now, again, I want to stress that I'm not talking about mean men, although I suppose some could be seen as mean. Maybe you have some stories about that, but not necessarily. These are men who care about education. But their interests, their beliefs, their values, their experiences then become central to how policies are thought about and enacted. And so their actions then are informed by all of that. And the periphery, which is highly feminized, then has to take up these highly masculinized policies, and this can create some dissonance. So you can see the conclusion of the paper for a condensed analysis of these ideas, and I'll stop there because I think that I don't need to go over that again. But I do hope that this has helped. I know this has been lengthy. I apologize for that, but I hope that it will be helpful to you as you read through the paper.